Welcome. I'm Robert Pondiscio, a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. I'm delighted you could join us today for this conversation on instructional illusions, what we get wrong about good teaching. The response to this topic has been striking. The impetus for today's webinar was a guest essay by Paul Kirschner on my Substack, The Next 30 Years. It was titled Instructional Illusions. It quickly became one of the most widely read and widely shared pieces that I've published this year. That reaction, I think, tells us something important. There's an enormous appetite among educators for clear, research-grounded thinking about teaching and learning. Frankly, that's not surprising. Teaching is one of the very few professions where deeply rooted ideas and intuitions about practice often persist, even when the evidence behind them is weak or, frankly, non-existent. Many of the ideas that we discuss in schools every day have a powerful surface-level plausibility. We assume students learn best by discovering things for themselves. We equate visible engagement with learning. We assume collaboration is inherently superior to direct instruction. And because those ideas feel humane, modern, and intuitive, they often go largely unquestioned. But as our guests will argue in their new book, and you'll hear today, many of these assumptions are not merely incomplete. In some cases, they actively obscure how learning actually works. What makes this conversation especially valuable is that it's not about defending traditional teaching versus progressive teaching or reducing education to slogans and camps. It's about taking seriously what decades of cognitive science, educational psychology, and classroom research tell us about memory, attention, expertise, and the conditions under which novices become knowledgeable and capable. In a field as prone to fashion and pendulum swings as education, that kind of intellectual clarity is both refreshing, badly needed, and, dare I say it, rare. And we could not ask for better guides than today's panelists. Let me introduce them now. Paul Kirschner is an emeritus professor of educational psychology at the Open University of the Netherlands and one of the world's most influential voices on the science of learning and instructional design. His work has helped shape how educators think about cognition, expertise, and effective teaching practice. Carl Hendrick is a professor of education at the Academica University of Applied Sciences, a former English teacher, and a widely respected writer and speaker on evidence-informed teaching. He's done important work translating learning science into practical classroom guidance for teachers. Previously, he served as an English teacher and the head of learning and research at an inner-city London school. And Jim Heal is a professor of evidence-informed education leadership at Academica University of Applied Sciences and co-founder of Learning Science Partners, which works with schools to ground professional development in cognitive science and research on learning. Previously, he taught at Harvard University and also served as a school leader in the UK. We'll begin our webinar as we usually do with brief opening remarks from Paul Kirschner today. Then we'll move into a moderated discussion before turning to your questions. If you'd like to submit a question for the panel, please email Annika Hernandez at annika.hernandez@aei.org or post on X using the hashtag AEI Instructional Illusions. Thanks again for being here. And with that, Paul, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Robert. I don't usually read my slides. Cognitive load theory tells us that we shouldn't read our slides because it increases the amount of mental effort and it takes up room in your working memory that you need for other things. So I'll give some time to read my slides and not read them for you. Before we start, this in the bottom it says, weapons, WMDs are weapons of mass distraction. I know you're online, but turn off all your alerts. Like spend the next hour concentrating on what's going on and try not to look at your telephone and turn off all your notifications on the screen. The world's not going to come to an end, hopefully within the next hour. What's it all about, Alfie? Harry Houdini purportedly said this. There's no actual proof that he ever did, but let's say that he said it. One of the best known illusionists in history. And he said this because people are prone, they're almost genetically programmed to believe their eyes and their ears. Because if you didn't, then you possibly got eaten by a tiger or a lion or something like that. And instead of saying, well, I don't know if that's the case, you ran away, you believed your eyes, you believed your ears, and you thought, I better get out of here. And if you didn't, then you were taken out of the gene pool. So you have these illusionists, and they stand there, and you're looking at them, and you're thinking, what are they doing? And all of a sudden, this happens. And it's kind of like, he must have conjured that up. How did he do it? And what that person did was they made an illusion. They carried out an illusion. By the way, what we won't be talking about tonight, or for me it's tonight, is the illusionists. This isn't about naming and shaming of people. This is talking about the illusions themselves and not the illusionists. So don't expect us to come out and say, and it's done by this person. This is what an illusion is. Because I'm often asked the difference between what is an illusion and what is a myth. And this is an illusion. As you can see, an illusion doesn't exist. It's something that you make up in your head, that someone else lets you see and lets you feel. But David Copperfield really doesn't make the Statue of Liberty go away. He carries out an illusion in which you trust your eyes, but you shouldn't. Yeah? So it's not reality. And here are some examples. I went with my wife in Copenhagen to what's called the Paradox Museum. And you can see that I'm really a lot taller and bigger than my wife in the left-hand picture, but not in the right-hand one. That's pure optical illusion. Or how about this one? Yeah? That's a pure, and it's something that you see an illusionist do. And you look at it and you think, what the heck is going on? How can that be possible? But it's not only in the sphere of fun and games and expositions and exhibitions. We have also very psychological ones like this. And you look at it and you think those lines are completely different. Take at different lengths. But they're not. The arrows at the ends make your mind think that one is larger than the other. Now that's an illusion. And why do they work? Very simply. As I said, we're instead that we're cognitively predisposed, we are, but we're actually genetically predisposed to being deceived. We connect dots, and that's the way we make sense of the world around us. We see the bushes rustling. We connect the dots of bushes rustling, hearing it, seeing it, and the idea that there's a wild animal in there. And we connect the dots and we run away. And we don't wait to see whether or not it's a saber-toothed tiger or a rabbit. And I'm not talking about killer rabbits from Monty Python. Because if it's that type of rabbit, you better get the heck out of there as quickly as possible. But in any event, if you didn't do that, as I said, you'd leave the gene pool. So we're psychologically, but we're also genetically predisposed to doing this. Okay, that's an illusion. But the second question is, yeah, but aren't they myths? And the answer to that is no, they're not myths. Because an illusion is a complete distortion of reality. But it is reality. A myth is not. There's no base for it. Maybe one of the best known myths in education is this one, which is supposedly from the National Training Laboratories in Bethel, Maine. if you get in touch with them, they will tell you that yes, we published that once. No, we have absolutely no data to back it up. No, we have absolutely no idea where it came from. But schools of education have been built around the idea that if you lecture, people remember 5%. If you read something, 10%. And if you teach others, 90%. My question about that is, number one, how did they come up with the percentages, this myth? But the second is, how the heck can I teach others if I was taught through a lecture and I've only learned 5% of it? How do I do it? And actually, the lecture and you're reading the slides and you're making use of audio visuals, it should be added up. So in some way, shape, or form, you're ending up with 170% of what I tell, which is really great because then I only have to talk for 5 minutes and you think I've been talking for an hour. But that's the idea. This is a myth. There's absolutely no basis in it. But at the same time, there's always a grain of truth in it. That this learning pyramid is based upon what was known, which was a cone by Edgar Dale, and he made it was one of the first books on education and teaching in 1954, and he said we have all these different media that we can use: films, phonograph, all of those types of things. We have to realize that there's one thing is more concrete than the other. What you write down is less concrete than what you see or what you feel. It's because the signs, the signals, the letters are completely abstract. And so it's a more abstract, it's something if you write it. And so the top of that cone of abstraction was lecture and writing. But it has nothing to do with how much you learn and how much you retain. So that grain of truth from Edgar Dale's cone of experience, that's within this myth. Or take this one, which we all know about. Yeah? Learning styles. This is one of the 82 learning styles that have been defined. Yeah? And here we know, it's called the meshing hypothesis, that there's absolutely no proof that learning styles exist. We know that there are learning preferences, but learning styles don't exist, that someone is a visual learner or an auditory learner. Complete falsehood. But the grain of truth in that comes from Alan Pavio's dual coding theory, in which he said our working memory has a space that records what we see, visual, and a space that records what we hear or hear in our own mind's ear. And so people said, well, if that's the case, then we have people who are primarily visual and other who are primarily auditory. And so they've mutated this idea of dual coding or multiple coding and changed that into learning styles. Finally, people ask me how we started on the book. And Carl, Jim, and I were just rounding off, and correct me, guys, if I have this wrong. We were rounding off our second book, How Teaching Happens. And in just a verbal free-for-all, we said, yeah, but what's this one kind of like red line running through how learning happens and how teaching happens? And I think it was Carl who said it, but I'm not quite sure, who said, yeah, that the line running through is paradox. It's paradoxical. Things that we think work don't work, and things that we think don't work do work. So we started on a book of paradoxes. But going through it, we realized not all of the things that we were talking about were paradoxes. These were the illusions that eventually ended up in the book. One of them, I think it was Jim who said it, and I thought it was a great quote. Please again correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm attributing to the wrong person. He said, an expert teacher is someone who knows what to do when they don't know what to do. Yeah? which sounds very paradoxical, but it's true, because what is a paradox is one of my favorite illustrations for paradox. A paradox is an expert teacher knows what to do when they don't know what to do. That's an apparent contradiction, but it's actually very true. And it makes you think about what is now an expert teacher, and what does an expert teacher do, and what can an expert teacher do. And based upon the pedagogical, psychological, instructional knowledge that she or he has, they're capable of responding in the second to unforeseen things that are going, and they know what to do even though they don't know what to do. And one of the, for me, most well-known paradoxes is the Five Desirable Difficulties from Robert and Elizabeth Bjork, because what you're saying to people is, if you want them to learn better, make it harder. Whereas our way of thinking is, no, my job as a teacher is to make it easier for my students. So it's kind of like a paradoxical thing, but it's also very, very true. If you're training someone to run a race, you'll have them do things that make it harder, like running up the stadium steps in 30 seconds and then 25 seconds, or with a backpack on, so that they build up their lung capacity, they build up their legs, so that when they need to actually do it, they can do it. And a second one is this, which we chose not to add to the book because we thought it might be a little bit too controversial, and that progressives, and I must say I'm very left-wing, but I'm very conservative educationally, we tend to do things that we think will help the poorer students, the disadvantaged students, but that which we do dumbs them down and does the exact opposite of what it was supposed to happen. Now I'm going to go very quickly into the basics of how we learn. Yeah. And this is kind of like pulling back the curtain for Dorothy, the Tin Woodsman, the Cowardly Lion, and the Scarecrow. Now that's what we're trying to do, pulling back the curtain on the different illusions. And as I said, the illusions and not the illusionists. And as the first one, I'm going to discuss kind of like as a kickoff, because after I'm finished with this one thing, Robert will take it over and we'll go through a number of other illusions. But I thought I'd kick it off with the engagement illusion. And that's, the people are working. And because they're working and engaged with what they're doing, they're probably learning. But what we know from people like Professor Robert Coe is that's not the case. Being engaged could be physically, emotionally, socially, but the only type of engagement that leads to learning is cognitive engagement. But cognitive engagement is the one engagement that we can't see. So when we look at a classroom and we think they're engaged, colorful things, animated discussions, interactive games, those types of things, they look engaging, they look like the students are busy learning, but they aren't. This is a typical example. You see kids learning, again, with air quotes, about volcanoes, and they spend 3 or 4 weeks doing this project, and they make these beautiful paper mache volcanoes, and inside is a plastic bottle, and they fill that with Coca-Cola or Pepsi-Cola or something like that, and then they throw in a Mentos mint or two, and white things bubble out of it over this, and everyone goes ooh and ah, and the teacher thinks it's great, and the parents think it's great because they make these beautiful volcanoes. But then if you ask them from how does magma differ from lava and um, plate tectonics, what's now the correlation between the movement of the tectonic plates and an eruption of a volcano, they look at you as if they're seeing water that's all just caught on fire. Because they've been very engaged. They've been spending weeks, a couple of hours a day, working on this valuable time that they actually could be learning, but they were actually not really learning. They were working together because there was no cognitive processing of what was going on. You find these children, the most beautiful anecdote is children who were busy making a video about Martin Luther King and could do incredible video things and cut and splice and all of those types of things, but didn't know the difference between Martin Luther King and Martin Luther. And they thought that Martin Luther King got into problems because he had a dispute with the Pope. That's what they learned while making that beautiful video. So what's going on? Sorry about that. You see this happening. That's what you see. Craig Barton has the famous Swiss roll experiment, and that's what he said. What I wish I knew when I was a teacher, and what he did was he had how do you divide 7 pies of the same size equally between 3 students, 3 people, and that's hard because it's not intuitive in how to do it. And he did that with these Swiss rolls. And he brought in 7 Swiss rolls and he gave them all knives. And the children learned how to do that. But years later, when he encountered his students again and asked them the question from, how are things going? How's your math going? Because he was a math teacher. They would say, yeah, but God, it's so incredibly boring. It's not like your class, Mr. Barton. He said, oh, please tell me about it. And they told him about the Swiss roll and how much fun they had and how delicious it was. And then he asked them, do you remember how to solve the problem? The answer was no. None of them remembered it. So they were very busy. They were engaged. They were having fun, but they didn't learn. Add to this, Graham Nuthall said this, and it's actually true. If you have children, small children, you know they love repeating and doing what they already can do. And there aren't very many who are adventurous and want to do things that they can't. So what you often see in those types of situations is this. But as we know from Robert Coe, those are poor proxies for learning. Learning is cognitively processing information. If you don't process the information, if you're busy on your telephone, if your weapons of mass distraction were on while you're listening to me and while I was presenting one of the slides, you have no idea what I was talking about. If you do a little bit of processing, kind of like making use of a highlighter, then you've done a little bit of processing because you know, okay, this is a keyword, so I need the pink highlighter. And, oh, this is a definition, so I need a yellow highlighter. So you've done a little bit of processing. You recognize what that text is, but you haven't actually processed it because there's no direct line between the nib of your highlighter and your brain. If you've done a lot of processing of it, thought about it, been stimulated or even forced to think about it, the learning is stable and stronger. And Eventually, at the end, the more and the more different processing that you do, the better you remember it. If you're busy, that's great, but you should be cognitively busy. And you can be very cognitively busy in a silent classroom and be not cognitively busy working with three other people to make the volcano. Robert, I'm done. Questions from you, questions from others. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Okay. Thank you, Paul. That was great, and thanks for kicking us off. I mean, just some background. The book was co-authored by all three of these gentlemen, but as I understand it, there were lead authors, so to speak, kind of like a Lennon and McCartney thing, where you know the Beatles wrote all the songs, but there was one or two principal authors. And if I'm not mistaken, Carl Hendrick was the lead author on the engagement illusion. So before we leave that one, I just want to ask Carl a question, which is, I found myself with such a feeling of recognition listening to Paul discuss the engagement illusion. I've been in hundreds of schools, hundreds of class visits. I cannot recall a walkthrough that did not start with, well, the students are either engaged or they're not. In other words, that is such a deep, reflexive way we have of looking at good teaching versus bad teaching. I think that's a fair summary. How did that happen? If this is in fact an illusion, how do we become so wedded to it?
Well, because it's a very poor effective construct. Because when we talk about engagement, some people think enjoyment, some people think cognitive engagement, some people think behavioral engagement, and usually the metric is self-reported. And it's just a true thing to say that engagement and fun are really lagging indicators of learning. There's an idea that you can walk into a lesson and you can correlate very strongly engagement with learning. But as Robert Bjork reminds us, learning and performance are very different. And things that, and but this is one of the main chapters in the book because um, it really goes against, as Paul has illustrated, what seems obvious on the surface. And this will bring us into a discussion about why we need a scientific rigor. But essentially, what about 50 years of cognitive science tells us is that present performance on a task is often the least valid or reliable way of determining what has been learned. And so kids can be very, very busy, very engaged, but that learning can be very transient. Conversely, the kind of activities that might look like nothing from the back of a room can often lead to long-term gains. But this, as we will say, and we will explore, my theory is that this emerges from a constructivist view of teaching, a social constructivist view that wants to see learning as a very visible enterprise, when our view is that, and to quote Paul, learning is a change in long-term memory.
So give me some practical advice if I'm a teacher who has been conditioned to, if the students are, if the students, the one, you hear this all the time, the one who's doing the talking is the one who's doing the learning, and homilies like that. If you've been kind of acculturated into that mindset that engagement is learning, one, how do you break it? Two, what do you substitute it for?
As an English teacher, I instinctively reacted against social constructivism because almost every meaningful intellectual experience I've had in my life has been through reading books since the age of 12. It wasn't sitting in groups, shifting around my ignorance with another student. Sure, there were engagements and there were, conversations and people who inspired me, but for the most part, it was through reading Dostoevsky. It was through reading Joyce. It was a very kind of sacramental, internal, isolated thing. And so that really goes against the dominant paradigm of education for the last 70 years, which is the idea that learning is socially constructed. And essentially what's happened there is you've taken a truism, which is that knowledge is constructed internally, and you've smuggled in a pedagogy. And you've said, well, because we kind of construct knowledge, that's how we should behave. And last thing I would say, Robert, is I think engagement is sort of the wrong affect to chase in this respect. And the one I would sort of advise for is something nearer to what we might call satisfaction. And the satisfaction of hard work and working at something and mastering it, and then feeling that engagement is a transient,
A
very, very
sense of
transient
a
thing.
sense of accomplishment.
Exactly, Paul. A sense of accomplishment, a sense of achievement. And I think that we've optimized for the wrong thing in many classrooms because learning is, as we explore in the book, extremely difficult to observe directly.
Okay.
If I may add just one thing to that, Robert, um, it came to mind when Carl was discussing that. Um, Teachers, if you want to get a teacher really scared, have 30 seconds of silence. There's nothing more frightening for a teacher than having silence. Whereas silence allows you to concentrate. And what you want as a teacher is not to have it a lot of noise there, but you want people to be able to concentrate. You don't want them to have the visual noise, the verbal noise. But as a teacher, you kind of really get scared when the conversation breaks down and nothing is being said. And so the teacher is constantly looking, number one, to fill in that gap themselves. They don't give the child enough time to react because silence is threatening. And number two, see it as it were as a sign that they've done something wrong. And that makes it hard to break, in my humble opinion.
And let me play devil's advocate here a little bit. I mean, surely teachers should care at least a little, right? If their lessons are fun or enjoyable, or should they? To what extent at all does emotional engagement boost learning, or is that part of the illusion?
It's not
So I
a
think,
black and white thing. It's not a one or the other. People often say to me, from Paul, you're anti-motivation. And I say, no, I'm not. I think motivation is really important. I think that teachers should motivate their students to do things because you want to get them started on it. The problem is motivation doesn't cause learning. But learning, as Carl said, gives you a feeling of accomplishment and motivates you to continue and go further. So it's not an if. I'm sorry, I'm going into Dutch. It's and it's not or. And we tend to see it as black and white. So if you say we need to have them cognitively engaged, then the devil's advocate will say, oh, so you don't want them to be emotionally engaged. No, I didn't say that. Yeah. What I said is, if you want them to learn, they must be cognitively engaged. That doesn't mean they can't be emotionally or socially engaged, but they can be emotionally and socially engaged without being cognitively engaged. And that's the problem.
Jim, did you want to add on to that?
Yeah, no, one of the things I'm thinking about is this idea that it assumes that the content that we teach and that we would offer forth to learners is not in and of itself engaging enough, right?
Yeah.
So I'll sometimes say to people, tell me a lesson that you remember from childhood, and they'll say, oh, I'll never forget when my teacher came in dressed as Abraham Lincoln. He had the stovepipe hat and the beard and the whole thing. And then, of course, you only need to ask one simple follow-up question to that adult, which is, do you remember anything about the content of the lesson that was driving at? Which is exactly Paul's point about the about volcanoes. The question then becomes, is there not enough that's interesting about the life of Abraham Lincoln that it requires you to put this kind of sheen on it, rather than knowing enough about your subject and how to teach it in many different ways, such that you can make the to be remembered content engaging and compelling enough in and of itself. So we're kind of turning concepts and content and knowledge into something that requires a degree of bells and whistles that assumes that there's nothing compelling at the core.
Yeah. No, I think we're acculturated as teachers to think that part of us that we're performers to a certain degree, and that engagement is our job. But I appreciate the unpacking it the way you gentlemen have. Before we go on to a few other illusions that you describe in the book, I just want to take a step back and ask a couple of more broad questions. One of the things that is a constant in the book is using the term science of learning, and I've heard objections to this. We all have, I think, over the years, that this phrase implies there's a fixed authoritative body of knowledge about what learning is and what learning isn't, rather than an evolving process of debate and discovery. Is that a fair criticism for any of you?
Yeah, I'll kick off with that, I think.
Okay, thank you.
So, okay, the, science is provisional, but the mistake I think is in saying that all things are equally provisional. We have a set of hard-won facts that we know and that we can say with relative certainty around things like working memory, around things like the construction of knowledge, and it's our field has been largely dominated by a set of beliefs that are unfalsifiable. And what emerges out of that, what rushes into that space, are things like superstition, charisma, fads, gimmicks, a whole range of things that are they are not amenable to evidence or updating for evidence. Also, when we talk about science, science is anything but a fixed body of knowledge. If people say this is an authoritative power structure, the whole scientific enterprise is that it's a constantly self-evaluating, uh, um, it's constantly updating itself through repeated measures. If the field has been progressed through new studies, then the true scientist will clap their hands raw in approval. They won't say, no, it's not a kind of an article of faith. And so all the time the field is being pushed, and it has been pushed over many years. But what we're talking about here, Robert, is a range of different paradigms, from a scientific one to a sort of a philosophical or a sociological one. And the philosophical and sociological one, these are beliefs that are largely unfalsifiable. And so Bob Oakley has a wonderful phrase for this: cognitive realism. There's a number of things that we can say. These are probabilistic in nature, but all of these elements are not equally, as I say, provisional.
But you take my point, Carl, right? Which is that
Yeah.
I don't think I have no data on this, since we're being scientific here. But surely there's a resistance to this idea. In other words, the teacher who says, "Look, this isn't a science. This is an art."
But then number one, they don't understand what science is.
Okay.
Yeah, it's just that simple. And number two, teaching, as we wrote in our book, how teaching happens, is part artisanal and part scientific. And it's not an or, it is an and. It's both. Education is both. So I have absolutely no problem with the fact of that it's a science. And I can argue with someone that doesn't mean there's also not an art of teaching. It can be both. I mean, Leonardo da Vinci was a perfect example of the combination of the two. What was I going to say? Where I do have a problem with the term science of learning is that it's now become so broad and so diffuse that you could fit almost anything into it. And so it's become a worthless term. It's the umbrella for anything that anyone from any field thinks has to do with learning and teaching can bring under this umbrella term of the science of learning. And so it's become, for me, utterly useless.
Fair.
Uh,
Go ahead.
So if we're saying teaching is an art, then we have a serious problem because we're saying that about 1% can be successful.
Mm.
And I can say this as with some certainty as a failed musician myself. If teaching is an art, then it's not something that can be prescribed. It's not something that we should think of as a social profession. And imagine other professional fields of public service where we're saying dentistry is an art. It's not something that can be codified. It's not something where we can have checks and balances. It's not something where we can have an agreed upon professional body of knowledge. No, it's an art form. We wouldn't have it. And so with teaching, then, again, if it is an art, then it's a cruel one because we're saying that only a very few percentage of people will be successful at it.
And
Uh,
I'll sometimes use the language of like best available evidence, right? The notion that to Carl's point earlier, like there's a flux to this, and I think there's a way to make a virtue of it, even, which is to say, and I know that comparisons to the fields of medicine and others are a little tired, but sometimes I think they do get it right, which is to say, an orthopedic surgeon an orthopedic surgery in general knows more about how to replace a knee or a hip today than they did 5 years ago, maybe even 3 years ago. And part of what it means to be a professional and to be treated like one is to say that even someone as expert as an orthopedic surgeon has to then go back and better understand what that new knee or hip or process to replace them ought to look like. I've noticed that when this work is adopted by teachers, I see this happening in districts at scale, you see their sense of professional integrity and self-perception as a professional increase because that's what professions do.
If you look at that idea of what science is, there's a recent article by John Sweller, okay, Mr. Cognitive Load Theory, and that article by him is about the mistakes and the mistaken ideas that he had along the way, and how the carrying out of research on cognitive load led him to redefine, change around, better understand how cognitive load works. The fact that we're no longer speaking of three different types of cognitive load, but only two, and that germane load has been thrown out, is proof of the pudding that science evolves, and even the person who came up with the theory realized that there were things wrong in it, clapped his hands raw, as Carl said, and changed, amended the theory. That's what the science of learning is.
Since you invoked cognitive load theory and Swallow, this is a good transition to another illusion I want to discuss, which is the discovery illusion. And I think here in the US, this one is also very much in vogue. You wrote, I think it was Paul, the discovery illusion rests on a profound category error, the confusion between how experts create knowledge and how novices acquire it. And the expert's capacity for discovery represents the culmination, not the beginning of the learning process. Can you unpack that for us a little bit? Because this I feel
it's basically, and I don't want to be the person constantly talking here, so the other two can fill in on it because we've had a number of discussions about it. Number one, a novice is not just an expert who knows less. They see the world differently. They experience. Carl was also talking about the fact of this idea of constructivism. That's actually a very cognitive term because we're constantly constructing schemas in our heads, and constructivism is actually a very is a cognitive idea and a cognitive process. But the major problem, if you want me to unpack it and unpack it quickly, is very simple: is that people at a certain point in time came up with the idea that the epistemology of the expert, how the expert gains new knowledge is the exact same way as you should teach a novice to gain knowledge. You should treat them as junior scientists, but they don't have the knowledge to do that type of discovery. The only person who can do that discovery is, per definition, the expert. And by definition, a student isn't an expert. So by transposing the epistemology of how we as a society, as experts, gain knowledge, by transposing that into a pedagogy for how you should best learn it, that's the major mistake here. And that's something we need to confront ourselves with when we talk about discovery, because there are a lot of things that make it appealing, but people have to realize that the way the way the expert does it is not the way that a student should learn it. A scientist does science, a student learns science.
You're reading my mind. I mean, I feel like I've heard this 1,000 times. We don't learn science, we do science, or we need to train teachers, train kids to think like a scientist or think like a historian.
With what? Without knowledge, how can you think like a scientist?
There you go. Well, I mean, let me ask again, I'll play a bit of devil's advocate here. Is there a role, Jim or Carl, for discovery learning, or is it simply teach them what the expert knows?
I think there's a role for discovery, but as Paul just noted, you need information to think critically about. And so I think this is more a case of an order of operation than it is demonizing discovery per se. That is to say, if you can provide learners and have them learn enough of a grasp of the foundational concepts of a given domain, then of course part of what comes with an increasing degree of expertise is that students can become carefully, intentionally more agentic in their learning. The problem is that we put the cart before the horse and expect our learners to be agents of learning absent the means by which to do so. And so, this is a lot of where you see, I used to go in and observe a host of different types of classrooms in a whole host of different types of schools, including among them, these are the elite private schools in which students sit around and have a Socratic seminar in which they seemingly, weave together ideas that, no 16-year-old ought to, be able to weave together in the way that they would. And the illusion is that you would sit at that table and be forgiven for thinking that those learners are making up those ideas and how they interact with one another out of whole cloth. The reality is that they have been taught in what we might argue are much more traditional ways, so that they have really robust knowledge. And with that knowledge, it's like throwing a clay pot. You can start to express yourself once you have some clay on the wheel, not prior to even having the means with which to shape that information and make better sense of it.
It's easy for me to imagine and I've seen it, what discovery learning looks like in a math class, in a science class, even in a history class. Carl, as the former English teacher here, is there an equivalent to this in ELA, and how do we avoid it, if so?
So if you look at a lot of the evidence on what we call the science of learning, you're right, it comes from maths and science, and it largely comes from postgraduate students in labs. The thing with ELA in English is that it is, as was defined in the 70s, an ill-defined domain, as opposed to a well-defined domain of science and maths. That is to say that if you're decomposing an English curriculum, it doesn't decompose neatly into knowledge units that you can then build up and teach. But the question of whether a novice learns better through explicit instruction or discovery is an empirical one. And the empirical evidence is overwhelming on this. Overwhelming. That if you have little schema, if you have little knowledge in your long-term memory, then it's that much more difficult. And lastly, I would say discovery assumes that there is something to connect. Discovery is, as Dan Willingham minds is understanding is remembering in disguise. And so discovery is going, that's similar to this other thing that I have. I'm discovering this. I'm making these connections. So without that knowledge in place, then it's the discoveries, it's sort of like the culmination of a journey rather than the beginning of it.
Mm. And we know from Sweller's work as well, like if you think about his work into means end analysis and the notion that when you leave students to their own devices, the best that they can come up with is to guess and check and guess again and check again and keep on doing that. And even if you were to approach this from an entirely utilitarian point of view, what a massive waste of everyone's time. If all we're doing is trying to stumble our way towards, accurate, relevant knowledge.
Carl had a great example of that. I think it was in the book about one paragraph from a book. I don't know who it was from. It might have been from Dickens, in which seemingly common words used in a different context, if you didn't understand that, even though you could read and you knew what the word meant, you could never understand what the paragraph was about.
Mm-hmm.
So you can't even discover the meaning of a paragraph where you can read every single word if you don't have the background knowledge to understand the idiom, how a certain word is used here in a different way, in a metaphorical way, and not in a literal way. I don't remember which book it was, but I thought it was brilliant, Carl. That
it was it was Jekyll and Hyde, a book that I taught for a long time, and it illustrates, I think, the idea that for example, reading comprehension is not a skill. Reading comprehension is the culmination of a range of things, such as a rich vocabulary, but also it's a vocabulary that lives in 100 different places. It doesn't live in an X equals Y. This word means that. A lot of students can learn the definitions of words, and then when they try to use or apply those words, they use them in ways that are completely wrong. The classic example is George Miller's study on vocabulary, where he gave students, 11-year-olds, a word, got them to define the word, and then use the word. And one of the words was meticulous. And the students learned that that word means to be very careful. And the sentence one student wrote was, "I was meticulous about falling off the cliff." And that to me illustrates another important point, is that knowledge is at its worst when it's static. And so it's the same with the science of learning, that you can understand what retrieval practice is, but it has to be a dynamic process where it lives in a particular context. And so language, and the problem with ELA is that words and meaning memory is semantic in nature. We understand the world through meaning. We don't understand it through that very crude definitional sense.
And Carl, if I may offer one more example, I know that time is marching on, but I have a visual representation of this example. We tried to find a meme that would represent what we're trying to say about this notion of the difference between experts and novices, and how oftentimes experts expect that novices can just stumble their way towards being as good as they are. And this was the meme. We said, how to draw an owl in 2 easy steps. Figure 1, draw 2 circles. Figure 2, draw the rest of the damn owl. And the notion being that, if you can do this, this might seem like a distant memory. And if you only know how to do this, this must feel like flying to the moon. And yet our expectation sometimes as experts is that we think that hop, skip and a jump from novicehood to expertise doesn't involve schematic advancement or making our schema more sophisticated in ways that are not always visible or demonstrable.
And a lot of practice. We're going to go to audience questions shortly, but I want to make time, however briefly, to discuss another illusion in the book, which I think is critical for teachers here in the US, which is the student-centered illusion. This idea that, of course, our pedagogy must be student-centered. Jim, I think this was your chapter. You
Mm.
seem to suggest in that chapter that the debate between teacher-led and student-centered learning is a false dichotomy, or perhaps a political disagreement more than a substantive one. Am I characterizing that point correctly? And can you explain it in a bit more detail?
Yeah, I mean, certainly there's a pedagogical dissonance between those two ways of thinking. There is, I would argue, philosophically a difference as well. And I did hint at the notion that there may even be political predeterminants going on there. In that regard, I was talking, and I think Paul mentioned this earlier, the idea of sort of prog versus trad thinking, and the notion that if you put 100 people in a room and half of them talked about the notion of student-centered learning and that students ought to be given agency and freedom and the ability to iterate on their own terms. And then you had another 50 that were saying, no, no, it's the teacher that needs to shape the way that the work happens. Could you map to a certain degree how they feel about what schools ought to be and how students ought to be and how teachers ought to act? And so part of what I wanted to try to communicate in that chapter is that they don't cancel each other out. The only reason that we consider them oppositional is that we kind of caricature them. You assume that, teacher-led instruction is students sitting in rows and not saying a word, and you're here to listen and not be heard. As opposed, and then on the other side, student-centeredness as a caricature is, off you go. I'll put you in different pods. One of you is going to be the timekeeper, and I'll be in the corner checking my emails. And I think that unless we have the eyes to see the nuance in the middle, it is a crude dichotomy. And I think there is a way to walk and chew gum at the same time as relates to those two things. And part of how I conclude with that is to say, yes, students can, of course, be at the center of their own learning, but ultimately it's because they ought to be the ultimate beneficiaries of it rather than that they are the kind of de facto teachers where there's also a person in the room who's called a teacher, I seem to recall. And so I think that you can still place students at the center of their learning, but rather as an accommodation of this is what they are already bringing into the space. This is my best estimation, informed estimation as to the schema that they currently hold, and I can teach in accordance with schema because I know what they've got that will enable them to pick up what I'm putting down.
Exactly.
That learners at the center, but it doesn't hold them singularly responsible for the act of learning.
The
You
paradox that I often state is the most student-centered instruction or education is teacher-led.
Right.
They don't cancel each other out in any way. They're not in opposition, but a good teacher is centered on having their students optimally learn.
Mm-hmm.
Hannah Arendt said a version of education needs to be traditional in order to be progressive.
Mm-hmm.
And explicit instruction for me is an act of great kindness. It's saying to a child who is less cognitively able, some of this is going to be hard, but I'm going to be here with you. I'm going to take you through every step of the way. I'm going to show you that you could be better than you can be yourself. And I'm not going to make you feel better in the short term to have a greater fall down the line. Learning really needs a form of friction. And if you remove that friction, then you remove the possibility of learning and that child becoming a better version of themselves through knowledge.
Jim, you made an offhanded and I assume comic reference to group work a few moments ago, referring to timekeeper and whatnot, which strikes a chord for a lot of us here in the States because we were told that is great pedagogy and great teaching. Do you want to say a word about group work before we leave this topic?
Well, yeah, I mean, certainly group work in which roles are allocated of that nature, because as with anything where we label students by any means, it becomes kind of self-fulfilling. So if you say who wants to be the timekeeper or who wants to be the scribe, then you're likely to have the person that is least willing or wanting to do the thinking that day. I could get to say, well, if I'm scribe, I just have to, write what I hear. And even if the students aren't being as cynical as to try to say, oh, I'll take that role, even if they were by default allocated one of those roles, what are you actually inviting them to think about in that condition, right? Like if all I'm worrying about is whether or not we're going to get all of this done in the next 3 minutes, then we're back to the engagement illusion again, right? And so I think group work. I'm not demonizing group work full stop, but I'm saying that the likelihood of loosely bound instructional conditions massively increases unless you know exactly how to group and how to set to task learners, but give them the means by which to do that.
Yeah, I just want to add, I used to have a chair in collaborative learning, and I did a lot of research on collaborative learning. And one of the major problems with it is that teachers haven't learned how to pose a task that's cognitively complex enough that it requires more than one student.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And then they're only going through the motions, or you had, if it was computer supported, well, you have to make 5 comments on it, and if you didn't, then you didn't pass that thing, because the task didn't, students are very calculating. It's what's in it for me, and why should I devote more time on something than I actually need to? And if the task is is not complex enough, the benefits of working together are much smaller than the costs incurred of coordination and collaboration. So they won't work effectively together.
Okay. I'm mindful of time. Let's see if we can blaze through. We have quite a few audience questions, so let's see if we can tick them off fairly expeditiously. First one, does the illusion of engagement mean that teachers should avoid project-based learning? Anybody?
Well, project-based learning, again, we can think about that in terms of subject-specific. Project-based learning, I think, is, maybe appropriate for certain science subjects, maybe inappropriate for others. But again, I think the thing to be wary of here, and really what we should be moving towards, is a model that is not about a generic pedagogy. As Christine Council said, you can't rose and shine your way into a bad curriculum, and any more than you can do the opposite. So I think project-based learning might be appropriate for projects, but as a kind of generic pedagogy in and itself, it doesn't have a good track record.
I love this question. What does Bloom's taxonomy get right and wrong about teaching?
Hmm.
Paul, if you're laughing, you get that one.
Now, what does it get right and wrong? It gives you it gives you a framework to understand that there are different levels of knowing and understanding. It doesn't give me a handle in any way as to what type of pedagogy I should use.
And certainly that in some way it ought to be hierarchical, which is
Yeah,
more,
which it isn't.
which is less Bloom and more how Bloom has been mutated into, the notion of a pyramid that I'm pretty sure Bloom at no point actually
Had
envisaged.
never, no, he hasn't
Yeah,
ever.
no.
I always say, beware, as soon as you see a triangle,
Hmm.
because they call it a pyramid, but it's a triangle.
Yeah,
As soon as you see it, don't believe it.
yeah, yeah.
If they've
There's-
if they've decided it has to be in a pyramid,
yeah.
it's probably a myth.
I think it's probably just some overzealous teacher 25 years ago who thought this will look great as a hierarchy of operation, and
Yeah,
it's not like a video game where you have to move up through the levels.
yeah.
I
As
have
a
to
general rule, Robert, if you see a triangle or if you see a circle with arrows going around in 4 quadrants, run for the hills.
Run for the hills.
Very good. Can you talk more about the misconception that teacher talk is bad? I must say one of my takeaways is teacher talk is good.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Depends.
Yeah, I can speak to that. About 20 years ago in the UK, something that was de rigueur was the idea that if you talk for longer than 8 minutes in a single hour lesson, that is somehow a fail or something that's bad. And again, it's based upon the idea that talking or being active or engaged is a visible sign of learning. Now, no one is saying that a teacher talking at students for an hour is a good form of pedagogy, but it will surprise many viewers to learn that within the explicit instruction paradigm, and I'm talking about the Hollingsworth and Ybarra model, not the capital D, capital I model, but even that model as well, it's highly interactive.
Yeah.
It is highly back and forth with the instructor and the student. In fact, in the Hollingsworth and Ybarra model, they advocate that the teacher talk for no longer than 2 minutes without checking for understanding. So when we talk about explicit instruction, we're talking about highly cognitively engaged and highly active.
Yeah.
This is why we have to norm our terms through specificity,
Yeah.
right? Teacher talk. What kind of talk? Project-based learning. What kind of project? Right. And it's a little bit like the same thing that's being leveled at the science of learning, which is to say, if it could mean everything, it doesn't mean anything.
Yeah.
Here's a provocative question. After the replication crisis and concerns about questionable practices like p-hacking, psychology is a field increasingly in disrepute. I didn't say that. The questioner says that. Why should teachers trust what psychologists have to say?
Very good question, because we have many studies that have been replicated at scale. We have many studies that find repeatedly the same findings in a range of different contexts with a range of different cohorts. Many of the studies that the questioner is referring to is absolutely correct, but they are single studies. Many of the famous studies, like the Stanford prison experiment,
Yeah.
that also speaks to the kind of incentives that are in academia and how I think, the very fact that we're having that conversation, Robert, means that something is going right. The fact that there is a self-correcting mechanism that is at least calling into question methods. But if you have an unfalsifiable proposition, then you can't even do that.
By the way, before we leave that, Doug Lemov remarked not long ago in a conversation I had with him and Emily Hanford that it just seems like the rest of the world is further ahead than we here are in the U.S. And this may be a disadvantageous question, but you guys are literally around the world right now. Carl, you're in Melbourne. Jim is here in the U.S. Paul is in the Netherlands. But do you have a sense here that we here in the U.S. are in fact just simply further behind on the so-called science of learning than the rest of the world?
I think I can offer something on that, like having sort of lived in this context and with the last 10 years and spent most of that time working in districts. I would argue that 8, 9, 10 years ago, I would have said that the gap was vast. I am encouraged the fact that there are what began as little bright spots, but is now expanding. I'll give you one example. Maryland, for instance, has become the first state in the union to enshrine into law legislation that says every single teacher in that state needs to have a foundational understanding of the science of learning and of how learning occurs so that they can make better teaching decisions as a result. The sense that, at least at the state level, if you can convince that, at the level of policy, that these things matter and to demonstrate why and how they can make a difference, I think the US's ability to scale with great acceleration is greater than that one can find in the UK, but that has been for better and for worse, right? That's how pseudoscience has been allowed to spread like wildfire. My hope is that those same mechanisms can be utilized to, rapidly expand this evidence-informed movement instead.
The United States has a unique problem, and it's not saying that they're behind or they're ahead, but that there are 50 different states that can determine what happens.
Yeah.
And within those 50 states, all the way down to the school board level, people can decide. And at this point in time in the United States, there is an aversion, let's call it, to what science says, from your Department of Health up to the president. I'm sorry if I'm now getting political. I'll try to stay out of it. but that makes it harder to have any changes. The fact that a minister of education in England can decide that all teacher training has to contain this, and this makes it a lot easier to get change than
Yeah.
if 50 states and 700 school districts all have a say in what's going on. And in each of that state, there are universities and colleges that can determine their own curriculum for what a teacher learns. It makes it very, very hard to
I also say though,
get
Paul,
the
that,
change that you want.
Robert, you'll have a much better sense of this than us, but I also feel that when a state is making gains and making noise about those gains, oftentimes other states will start to look over the fence and ask themselves what's going on down there, right? And that doesn't guarantee that it spreads, but I feel as though the US is at that cusp point where, I'm doing tons of work in Maryland right now for that very reason, and there's interest from New York and Illinois and other regions. But Paul's right; it's more atomized which makes that more difficult on the take up.
I was going to say that Paul actually understated the issue. It's not 50 states and 700 districts. It's 14,000 districts. So in a
Yeah,
way, while I'm not trying to gainsay what you just said, Jim, states feel like too large of a grain size to me.
yeah,
I'm as interested in what's happening in Maryland or Mississippi as anybody, but
yeah.
I'm also curious about which of the superstar districts in those states that we're all paying attention to.
And once something gets firmly entrenched, it's very, very hard to change it. And if you can't do it at a level of this is something that all teachers must get during their training, if you can't say that, it makes it very, very hard to modify something that is entrenched as the ideas of education and pedagogy in, for example, the United States.
Yeah, and maybe we can do another session on the illusions and discuss the role of schools of education here in the U.S.
Oh, definitely.
But let's not open Pandora's box with only a couple minutes left to go, shall we? Let's close on this question. It wouldn't be a science of learning webinar if we didn't discuss or didn't have a question about AI, artificial intelligence. So here's a question: how can we apply the illusions framework to the issue of AI tutoring and AI integration in the classroom? Let me summarize. Are illusions at risk of going away or getting deeper in an AI world?
AI has given us, and that will be my final statement, hopefully, a new illusion. And I wrote about it, the difference between offloading and outsourcing. And people speak of AI as if it can be a tool to offload some of the cognitive load in our working memory, but it's being used by people to outsource and do the thinking for them. And if something else is doing the thinking for you, you're not going to learn. And that's my problem with AI. And whether or not it's a good tutor or a bad tutor, if you can write a program to make it a good teacher, I mean, Sal can come. It was just an article in the New York Times about his what he was doing and how difficult it was to make a tutor that could teach as well as Sal can do it himself. Yeah. That's for me. I don't have a crystal ball. I didn't know that in 2026 I'd be talking about Chat GPT 5.4 thinking, whereas 2-3 years ago there wasn't even a Chat GPT 3. We were in Chat GPT and GPT 2. If I have no idea of that, I have no idea what direction it's going and what it will eventually do. It's evolving too quickly for me to say, give a good answer. But Carl just wrote something about that, if I remember correctly.
I got a slightly different view on that. I'm kind of bullish about AI for several reasons. One, I just read a report about absenteeism in the US, which is in some states at a chronic level. Second of all, many parents want to choose how and what and the means in which their kids are being educated. Um, Thirdly, the science of learning is extremely difficult because of what Robin Hogarth calls it's a wicked learning environment. When you have kids when you have kids working with tutors and specifically working with technology, you're turning that signal right up and you're getting a much clearer signal of learning. And when I say learning, I mean mastery. So mastery on particular cognitive tasks. So the science is going to, or could be when we have questions around spacing, interleaving, retrieval, we can answer those questions. Thirdly, is curriculum design. We are going to see, I think, incredibly well-designed curricula. And again, I'm sort of a materialist on this because I just think that there's lots of facets of the human cognition that will be better done by AI, lots of things that are better done by humans. But I think there's a lot of reasons to be positive about it. And I think that also when people talk about AI, they're basically talking about the unpaid models and using it like they're using Google. Unless you're training LLMs in the science of learning, which is a lot of the work I'm doing, and trying to generate outputs, then I think it's a very different conversation.
So Paul is against, Carl is bullish. Jim, you want to break the tie?
I think I'd rather land somewhere in the middle, forever the centrist. No, I think that as with any technology, it is as much about the user as the tool. You could give me a hammer, which has served humans pretty well for the longest time, but I can't put up a shelf. And the second thing I would say is that, as with anything, we need to be critical consumers of anything that comes our way, be that an inherited curriculum that claims to be a high quality instructional material, or a curriculum that is generated by AI. Unless we're willing and able to push back and scrutinize what is being generated on our behalf, then good luck. And I do therefore believe that learning science, in a sense, provides us with the eyes to see whether or not something passes the sniff test. And if we don't have that ability to scrutinize, I'm reminded of Thoreau, who once said we've become the tools of our tools, and I'm very wary of that.
Very nicely said. Boy, we could, and maybe we should, get the band back together in a couple of weeks to go through some of the other illusions. I feel like we've only just scratched the surface, but we are out of time. Before we wrap up, I want to thank our terrific panelists, Paul Kirschner, Carl Hendrick, and Jim Heel, not only for joining us today, but for the work that they have done for years to bring clarity, rigor, and intellectual honesty to conversations about teaching and learning. One of the themes running through this discussion today is that education benefits when we're willing to challenge our assumptions that have become fashionable or just taken for granted. That's not always comfortable work, but it's necessary work. And I think the extraordinary response to Instructional Illusions, the book and the Substack piece that I referred to earlier, suggests that many educators, I hope this is what it means, are eager for exactly this kind of conversation, grounded not in ideology or slogans or folklore, but in evidence, in professional judgment, and serious curiosity about how students actually learn. So let's have more of that. Before we close, I want to extend a special thanks, as I like to do, to Annika Hernandez, my colleague at AEI, who produced today's webinar and handled all the work behind the scenes to make conversations like this possible. If you've attended AEI events before, you already know how much care and professionalism she brings to these programs, and I'm deeply grateful for her work. And finally, thank you to all of you, our audience, for joining us, for the thoughtful questions, the provocative questions, and your engagement, if I can say that word now, throughout today's discussion. Have a wonderful afternoon, and we will see you again next month.